The opinions of the guests and host are their own and do not represent the opinions of Ironclad, the Border Patrol, or the Department of Homeland Security.
You look at DACA and DAPA, children of aliens, parents of aliens. A kid that's not a U.S. citizen that's crossed with his parents, a year old, less than a year old, they make it through, they make it to Chicago, that kid's raised there, and at 19, he's in college and he gets busted at a party for underage drinking. They find out, hey, you're an illegal alien. We got to send you back to Guatemala. Does it make sense to send a kid back that's never lived there, doesn't even speak Spanish, and then we're just going to send you back to country? No. And then same with parents. You have two illegal aliens that showed up in Houston, Texas. They had a kid. And the next thing you know, the kid's USC, but the parents are found out to be here illegally. The kid's 5 years old. And they're saying, all right, your parents are legal. We're going to send them back, So, but you're a U.S. citizen. I mean, there's just some things, if they're not criminals, they're working, we've got to put some logic to it.
We cut through the partisan talking points. We're not interested in perpetuating fear. We're interested in seeking truth, hearing what's really going on America's borderland. Welcome to Borderland, an Ironclad original. Today, we're bringing you perspectives on the border crisis from two different border town sheriffs. Sheriff Thaddeus Cleveland is the sheriff for Terrell County, Texas. Prior to being elected, he spent over 26 years in the U.S. Border Patrol. We'll also be hearing from Sheriff Leon Wilmot. He is the sheriff of Yuma County, Arizona, and has been in law enforcement since 1985. Some of his professional accomplishments include restructuring of the Southwest Border Alliance Drug Task Force to the newly formed Yuma County Narcotics Task Force. You may recall already hearing from these two sheriffs on our episode about Operation Lone Star. However, there is still a lot of new information to unpack from my conversations with both these gentlemen. Here's Sheriff Thaddeus Cleveland. Question, are you Hispanic by any means?
I'm not, no. Although I tell everybody that I'm puro mexicano en mi corazón. So again, Terrell County, Sanderson on the border, it's predominantly Hispanic community, but we weren't raised like that. It was Mario lived over there, Jimmy lived there, Jason there. I mean, we all just grew up together, and to this day, those relationships and those bonds. Johnny Bernal, who we talked on before we kicked off, he lived up the road in Fort Stockton. So we really didn't know each other, but our paths had crossed in the past. But no, I'm,
yeah,
I'm an American is what I am. But
yeah. So your Border Patrol career was at Sanderson Station?
No, so I started in Nogales, and man, you talk about it, back in '96 when I entered on duty, it was a blessing being stationed there because that was, the epicenter for border security at that time. And then as we all came into Nogales, and that started spreading that activity out to Douglas, to Naco, and I ended up leaving Nogales like every proud Tejano. I got to get back to Texas, got to get back to the motherland. And I got back after 4 years. I was never one of those that trashed Nogales. I loved it. They're a great relationship, great friends, beautiful country. But the moment I got home to Sierra Blanca, Texas, well, Sierra Blanca's not home, but the minute I got home to Texas at Sierra Blanca Station, I was like, man, what did I do?
Yeah.
So it took me another year and a half to get back to Arizona, and I promoted up to a supervisor in Douglas.
Yeah, it's Nogales. So what was the traffic at that time? Because when you talk about that was the epicenter, the traffic now is so different than what it was then. What was the traffic then, and as well as what was the demographics at the time?
So and let me tell you, and the traffic's very similar to what we have here in Terrell County. What we have here in Terrell County is nothing like you're seeing across the rest of the border. And I know we'll get to that, but in Nogales at that time, we were catching about 1,000 a day, illegal aliens, predominantly males, very, very, very few females back then, very few children accompanied or unaccompanied. It was back then, people looking just to come solely across to work, 30,000 people a month. And then narcotics was just, marijuana before the Rio Grande Valley became the Rio Grande Valley. Nogales was the king of the hill, if you will. So a lot of success there. And I really think growing up in a community like Sanderson, and just the way we're raised here, I mean, it's a small town. Back then it was less than 1,000 people. Now we're about 700. But just, we hiked the hills, we got out, we hunted, we did that sort of thing, and that carried over to Border Patrol. And for me, doing a lot of that stuff was second nature. I mean,
Yeah.
it was
Absolutely.
it was easy, man. Meaning it just came natural.
The question I have is the demographics. Was it Mexicans? Was it other than Mexicans, or what was the majority?
Primarily Mexican males, the vast majority. We did have some OTMs every now, some, and back there you would see Guats and Hondos. Where here we see very little of that still.
Yeah.
And again, I know I keep referencing. We'll get to that, but back then, no, it was what we hear about in the media as far as the change. Now it's anybody from all over the world, whether it's
Right.
men, women, viejitos, viejitas, accompanied, unaccompanied children. And I like to make in my my interviews, or I like to point out that right now it's so backwards, it's so upside down, because we'll allow anybody from around the world in to our country. Come on in, except if you're from Mexico. If you're from Mexico, we still send you back to Mexico. And even when we catch the Mexicans, they're like, why are you letting everybody else in and not us? And I'll be completely honest with you, again, growing up on the border and growing up next to the country of Mexico and crossing the border, doing our underage drinking and whatnot. If we had to allow somebody in our country, or we had to make a choice, I'd much rather see our neighbors to the south, who are the most Americanized, and even who still cross through Sanderson, Texas. The people we catch are mainly from Guerrero, Guanajuato, and Hidalgo. And they're all going to predetermined destinations that they've got family in different locations. They're going to California to pick fruits and vegetables. Those are from Guerrero. They head to a place called Santa Maria, California, to pick strawberries. Others are going to Arkansas to work in the poultry industry. Others are going to Kansas for the beef packing plants. And when I catch them, I have conversations with them, man. I mean, it's still, I still am, just intrigued by the whole process, the journey. They're humans, man. They're humans. And
Right.
So many people, even Americans, like to dehumanize the whole border issue and what's going on. And I think they forget how much our economy relies on illegal labor to do the work.
Let me make a few points here for those who are listening. I asked the sheriff here about the traffic in his time and the location, because every border has a different trafficking kind of scenario, if you will. Some areas are heavy drugs, some areas are heavy Mexicans, some areas are different. So at one point, Eagle Pass, Texas was heavy Brazilians, and the border across the border the traffic is different in every sector at different times. Currently, right now, the traffic you see on the news is what you have currently. I used to work in Eagle Pass in 2009 to 2013, and the traffic was maybe a good day. You might catch 100 migrants crossing illegally. And so it's important to note that the traffic kind of shifts with the times, and the type of demographics that come across is important to identify that, because what we have currently is very different. And so I just wanted to kind of put that for those who are listening who might not know the depths of what the Border Patrol career field is, but as well as understanding the different traffic patterns in different sectors. You mentioned something that I thought was fascinating is, the other OTMs, that's called other than Mexicans. What most people don't know is that's how we identify them. That's the identifier was actually created by smuggling organizations, but we use it currently in our process to identify who is the demographic coming across. Mexicans are Mexicans. Everything from South America past Mexico is going to be considered other than Mexicans. And then anything outside of that, your other countries, Africa, Middle East, anything else, we would consider exotics. And those are very rare for us to see on the border. And so those listening, just so you guys stay along with the conversation at times, I want to make sure you guys know those things. Sorry, Sheriff, I just want to make sure, it's just a little housekeeping for those who are listening so we can keep them on the conversation. Everything you're saying is awesome. Like, you're right on target. I love hearing your opinion. I think the most interesting thing that you mentioned is not everyone sees it the same way as they're humans. And that is a challenge, because when you have these arguments in the media, not even just media, in social media, right? Just the average person who doesn't really understand it, they're emotionally invested in this topic, and they want to just jump to conclusions like, shut the border, forget it, close it completely. And then there's the other side of the argument that says, open the border, right? And so those two arguments are the stark differences from different sides of the political spectrum, but also just the way people see the border. You're someone who's not of Hispanic descent. You've grown up on a border. You've been raised around a border town. So you've seen it in the most human eyes possible. And so your mentioning of they're human is not something that the average person outside of a border town would even acknowledge for some reason. And I wanted to make sure that people really understand that comment from you. You know, if you wouldn't mind elaborating on where is it that moment when you realize, like, man, they're no different than us, but they're in a different country. That kind of connection to it, or the empathetic views, I think is valuable for us as a country to kind of get down to the foundation of, hey, step back, and let's not judge the situation. Let's just identify one thing: those are humans, and it's not for me. Like you as a border patrol agent, it wasn't for you to determine what the outcome of it is just to apprehend any individual coming across and then process them as per policy. And so for you to mention that, Sheriff, I find that very fascinating, but also, you know, I love that you said that.
Well, you know, even in my interviews that I have, I guess because I was a border patrol agent now to the sheriff's office, you know, a lot of media attention, and I even catch myself, and I'm at times disappointed when I call them they or them, because again, you know, that they are, and I use the term illegal aliens, I always will, you know, that you know, has no negative connotation to it. It's a term that we use. But you know, going to speaking to back in Arizona, and I'm trying to frame up. You know, so I used to be a PIO, public information officer there in Douglas as well, community relations officer. Something I did not want to do. Victor Monjadas was our patrol agent in charge at that time, and I can remember sitting in his office and go, man, I'm just a field soup. I just want to be a field soup, and them really pushing me to do this, and I'm glad he did, because it gave me some other experiences in communication and talking and really educating people about our job. But you know, the first thing I like to tell folks when I'm on interviews and whatnot or ride-alongs is, you know, we're blessed to be born in this country. Why I was picked to be born here, I have no idea. But had I been born anywhere else, I'd be doing the same thing. We're still the greatest country in the world. And it's because of rule of law, along our border that unfortunately right now we don't have. And that's not because of our U.S. Border Patrol agents. That's because of the people of this administration. And you've probably heard me say before that you take it back to when I first came to the Border Patrol, President Clinton was president. And then to President Bush, President Obama, President Trump, and then about a year and a half of President Biden. But those first four administrations, they all contributed to border security. They all built upon what the previous president had done, some more than others, of course, and we know which ones those were. But still, President Clinton and President Obama, they still built border fence.
Yeah.
You know, President Biden, our current president, under President Obama as the vice president, they built border fence. So what's happened now is there's no policy at the border. There is absolutely, it's lawless.
Yeah.
Meaning, you know, it's a free for all, and right. That's the word I typically use, a free for all. And it's still it's two different issues. Border security. We must establish border security before we even look at immigration reform. So when that Senate bill they just put forth, that was really, you know, an immigration reform, but it didn't deal with border security. We have to secure a border.
Yeah, talk more on that. Those who don't understand that one, because that's still new to me. I was trying to read up on it, but that new bill that they're trying to pass, what was it? Why is it such an issue?
Well, the first bone I had to pick with it was, of course, they wanted to call it a border security bill, but it included $60 billion for Ukraine, $17 billion for Israel. And look, veteran myself, I actually got a son that's deployed out to the Middle East right now. I am a supporter of the United States of America going out and being kind of that police force in the world, meaning protecting those that can't protect themselves. You know, growing up, I bullied a little bit. I may have done a little bit of bullying, but I also kind of stood up to those bullies as well for other friends. And I believe in us doing that as a country, taking care of those countries that can't take care of others. And again, having a son that's serving. But if we're going to focus on a border security bill, let's focus on one that just talks about the border. And the second one I had to pick with it when it started talking about numbers, you know, certain trigger points, you know, we'll shut the border down if we reach this many a week or this many a day. Well, look, when I was in Arizona back in the late 90s, early 2000s, we were so busy that the assistant U.S. attorneys started establishing thresholds for marijuana smuggling, for illegal alien smuggling. And I can remember one of the first thresholds being 500 pounds of marijuana. If you had 500 pounds or more, you'd be prosecuted. If you had 499 or less, you wouldn't. Illegal aliens was about 20 in a load. If you had 20 or more, prosecuted less, you wouldn't be. So what did the cartels do, the smugglers do? They played the numbers game, 499 pounds, 19 illegal aliens. So if our government starts playing the numbers game, it's just going to play right into the cartel hand. It's not going to solve anything at all.
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating how that worked. It's fascinating how the smuggling organizations have really good communication with what the climate is on the ground. They understand what in which sector would potentially, be more available to them or not. And once they know that, they shift areas. It's been happening for years and years and years. And rapidly. It's faster than any kind of communication that we have, communication on our side. It's impressive, quite frankly. It's impressive. Yeah. This new border bill, what most people don't realize that it does have those stipulations for Ukraine and Israel, and that could raise questions for a lot of people. Like, well, if I have to sign this bill, but then if I sign this, I'm going to be sending this much money there. That doesn't rub everyone the right way. And personally, I think you're right. I think we need to focus on our border first, right? I think we need to really address this situation we have here currently. When I say the situation currently, I'm curious, what is it that's kind of been, and you've touched on it, but I want to make sure that we're catching this. What is it that makes right now different than when you were as a border patrol agent? Like when we have illegal migrants coming across the border and they were processed back in your time, it's starkly different from what it is now. And what is the difference between now and then?
Man, right now it's just the sheer amount of people coming, the numbers. I mean, numbers like we've never seen before. Even in my home community, it equates, meaning what's going on everywhere else is even going on right here in Sanderson, Texas. So, for example, the first year President Biden took office, as opposed to the last year President Trump was in office, talk about apprehensions alone. We had a 289% increase that first year. That second year, FY22, compared to Trump's last year, it was a 418% increase. You're talking about a station here, about 50 agents is what we have. And I still say weeks. I still talk as if I am a Border Patrol agent, and I'll make a couple comments to that. But 91 miles of border is what they're responsible for here. Terrell County has 54 miles of river, and then the Border Patrol agents, actually the map behind me depicts it, but they have the southeast portion of Brewster County, which is about 32 miles of border. 37 miles of border, 91 miles of border that they're responsible here for 50 agents. Now, we don't have the activity here like you do in other places because we don't have an urban to urban environment. We don't have a lot of infrastructure south of the border to facilitate a large flow through here. And then we don't have a lot of infrastructure here on this side to get them out of here. So we just don't see that level of activity. But we went from about 1,000 apprehensions a year pretty consistently to 5,500 apprehensions to 7,400 apprehensions. Now let me add a little bit more to that. We're the busiest station, historically have been, between Del Rio, Texas to El Paso, Texas. That's about 600 miles of border in between there. So this area has always been utilized, and it's always been a hot spot. Again, you can't build a 200, 300 man station here because we don't have the land. We're built in a canyon. It looks like mountains and hills, but it's all just canyon land running to the Rio Grande. And with that, gotaways are typically just above apprehensions. Then we have the unknown, those that weren't apprehended or counted as gotaway, which we know we have those. And then we have deaths. Historically, one death a year. And since this administration took over, we've had in the last 3 years, 37 deaths. We went from one a year average to 37.
Wow.
Again, very commensurate is what's going on along the rest of the U.S.-Mexico border.
What is it that's caused such a massive influx? What's the reason why trafficking organizations are pushing more bodies across the border now than ever?
Great question. And I attribute it to it was September 12th, 2019. It was a presidential debate on Univision. do a quick Google search on it, and President Biden at that time said he would welcome asylum seekers. He encouraged them to come. And when he won the presidency, they knew the gates were going to be open, and they came. Now, if you recall, under the Trump administration, he was campaigning on, we're going to shut the border down, we're going to build a wall, we're going to make Mexico pay for it. And then that's when we started seeing those caravans saying, we're going to 4,000 people. But he countered that. When they caravanned up to come to the United States, he countered it with the migrant protection protocols that remain in Mexico, which was an extremely effective policy. And I want to come back to that. And then he held Mexico's feet to the fire. He told Mexico, either you do something about the border or I'm going to start increasing your tariffs. For the first time ever, we started seeing the government of Mexico on the U.S.-Mexico border, as well as the Guatemala-Mexico border. But going back to that quick point, this administration continues to say, first of all, Secretary Mayorkas says, we inherited this problem and it's a world migration event. Completely false. Has nothing to do with the world migration event. They were actually left the most safe and secure border. Again, all those four administrations built up upon to what Trump left them, right? And then you'll hear the president say, I need legislation and I need more money. This isn't about more money and it's not about legislation. All he has to do is bring that one simple policy, the Remain in Mexico, the Migrant Protection Protocol, and this would be solved almost overnight. It would act as a deterrent and it would stop people from coming. I wanted to make sure I got those two speaking points on the president and Secretary Mayorkas, what they continue to tell the media, but couldn't be more false. I mean, and I was taught not to say the word liar, but that they're not telling the truth. They are not telling the truth. Honestly, it's not about more money. Yes, you can always use more funding to hire more agents, more funding to put out more security and to create some more infrastructure. But to solve what's going on right now, it's just having a strong president that tells the rest of the world, you're not coming to our country illegally, and then to put forth that policy of migrant protection protocol. That would change. Either keep them in Mexico or once we allow them in, incarcerate them. Because as you know, just releasing them in the United States, we know they're not going to show back up. And even if they do, some of the dates they're given now, Vince, is 2031. Look, we're in 2024. The last date I saw was 2031. It's probably surpassed that. But even if someone does show back up, they're likely going to have some sort of abode, living in some sort of home. They're going to have kids. And we know when an immigration judge or an asylum, they look at it, they're going to go, you know what, this person's established home here. We're not going to send them back. So
let me, for those who are listening and watching, why is it that currently we are giving the notice to appears? From my understanding, is that the system is overwhelmed. And so if you are claiming asylum, they still have to wait for an immigration judge to see their case. And since they're so overwhelmed and there is no housing for a certain situation like this, there is nothing for a crisis like this, so that the only thing we can do is to release with a notice to appear a later date, and they can show up for that court date. But I recently looked into it, and less than 3% actually show up for that court date.
Right. Isn't that amazing?
So why don't we, if the funnel point to me seems to be the immigration judges, is it really a challenge to hire more immigration judges? That's something I've always asked. Just a question. Maybe you might know.
No, definitely. Well, you know, and they've actually, back under President Trump, when we saw a bit of an uptick, he built Border Patrol built the soft-sided facilities out of their own budget, and then he surged the border with immigration judges as well. Okay. So let me frame this back up. So back in 2020, I spent about a year at U.S. Army North. President Trump had first put the active duty military on the border, and I was Border Patrol's point man there. And my job was to of course, represent Border Patrol, to talk them through some of the policy help they were helping us with, building soft-sided facilities, building the fence, certain other things that they were doing. But so we surged the border with that sort of thing, you know. But so the point I want to get to is, you know what happened out at Ellis Island, you know,
Yeah.
100 years ago, 100 years ago. Look, yeah, this is different, but similar. And what I mean by that is, man, we had people coming over on the ships, and they weren't just showing up on ships. Some of them were being smuggled. Some of them were being coerced into jobs they didn't necessarily want to do. They were on a dock over in England, and someone walked up to them and said, "Hey, you got a ticket for America? Well, let me tell you what. If you want to go to America, when you get there, my cousin Vinny's going to be waiting for you. But he's got a job lined up for you."
I don't mean to cut you off, but I don't mean to cut you off, but I really love this quote that you mentioned. It says, "The circumstances we're witnessing today are reminiscent of the past, including the experiences of Ellis Island over a century ago, when people sought a better life. However, times have changed, and our solutions need to evolve accordingly." And that was your quote, and I love that.
So I want to make that comparison. So they're coming over on ships, being smuggled over. Not that everybody was. They're coming for a better life, whatever the circumstance was. They land on Ellis Island. Some are sick. Some needed medical attention. Some were bad people. They needed to be locked up for a while. We had infirmaries there for the sick. We had detention centers there until we were able to adjudicate what that person was where he was going to go, what he was going to stay. We need to do the same thing on our southwest border. We're behind the 8 ball, obviously, but we need to establish port of entries that are for, if you're coming to look to work, in the fields, okay, then you cross in San Ysidro, California. I'm just giving an example. If you're coming because of a humanitarian crisis, because you're from Central America and your country was hit by a hurricane or tropical storm, then you come through Laredo, Texas. But with that, we make sure we put the infrastructure there, whether it's immigration judges, medical personnel, definitely some detention facilities, and we outfit our southern border, because that's probably even along our northern border. At what point are we going to see our northern border even more utilized than what it is? So we're the smartest country in the world, man. I mean, we've got brilliant people. If my simple mind can come up with some ideas, man, people can just definitely come up with some better ideas. But it's not a hard solution to figure out.
No,
So I mentioned earlier about border security and immigration reform. We have to secure the border first, and then we do have to change some of our laws. Yes, if we'd just enforced the ones right now, we wouldn't be in this situation. But there are some that I think that we can work on. You look, and I know you wanted to talk about some of the pros and cons. You look at DACA and DAPA. Children of aliens, parents of aliens. You've seen it, I've seen it. A kid that's not a U.S. citizen that's crossed with his parents, a year old, less than a year old. They make it through. They make it to Chicago. That kid's raised there, and at 19, he's in college, and he gets busted at a party for underage drinking. They find out, hey, you're an illegal alien. We got to send you back to Guatemala. Does it make sense to send a kid back that's never lived there, doesn't even speak Spanish, and then we're just going to send you back to country? No, that's why that policy came forth, right?
Right.
And then same with parents. You have 2 illegal aliens that showed up in Houston, Texas. They had a kid, and the next thing you know, the kid's USC, but the parents are found out to be here illegally. The kid's 5 years old, and they're saying, "All right, your parents are legal. We're going to send them back." So, but you're a U.S. citizen. I mean, there's just some things. If they're not criminals, they're working. We've got to put some logic to it.
Yeah, and it's funny. How long does the average person take to apply to be a citizen legally? How long does that take on average? Have you seen?
I couldn't give you an answer to that, but on some it takes quite a while.
Yeah, I've seen some from 5 years to 12 years to 15 years just to try and get to become a U.S. citizen. And currently, right now, someone could come across illegally and find their way into the United States in 4 days. So there's discrepancies there when the challenge to become a legal citizen is, 1, expensive, and 2, challenging. Those are some things I think we need to look at. Something you mentioned earlier, and I want to circle back to. You said when you were apprehending back in the day in your original station, there was a majority men, almost no females. And it's funny because it reminds me of currently when you see videos of illegals coming across, and people are like, "Look at all those military-aged males." And I've tried to say the point to people is like, the majority of men who come across to work to send money home to their family are going to be military-aged males. And so when people use that term, I think it takes away from the reality of what we have. I think for years and years and years, it's been men who come across to work in fields and send it back home. And so it's almost a discrepancy, and it's almost used as a way to argue. It's almost a political point that people use in social media. And when you said that, I'm like, yes, I'm glad you mentioned that, because it takes away the validity of that argument. Not saying there is no fears of potential threats who come into our borders. I do agree that there is a high possibility, because currently the demographics that are coming across are a broad spectrum of different countries, and it's very different from the past. But when you saying the majority males, I think that's valuable, because most people probably don't know that majority of the men who come across are the ones who are working horses, are the ones who are going to send money back to their families.
And you're spot on with that, Vincent. And if I may, in that same vein, like the people we apprehend out here, and we have a lot of gotaways. And people say, well, they're coming out there, they're not surrendering at the border because they're trying to get away because they're criminals. Well, no, the vast majority of the people we catch out here aren't criminals. A lot of times they're first timers, first time they've been apprehended trying to cross out here. But they're not any worse. Yes, you're still gonna catch a few that have been here before and that have been arrested for a DWI or maybe a sexual offense or some criminal record. But a lot of times you'll hear the media or you'll hear political folks try to say, well, those that try to cross undetected, they're worse, and that's why they're trying to get in unseen. Well, no, that's in that same vein.
And now, here's Sheriff Wilmot. So when you first were working on the border, 20 odd years ago or so, what's the difference in traffic that you saw then when it comes to illegal immigration and drug trafficking to what you see now?
Back when I first started, it was the only fencing we had was 3-strand barbed wire that covered all of our border down there east of San Luis. You did have the old landing mat fencing down by the city of San Luis, which was put up, and that was pretty much it. But back then, we didn't see a whole lot of what we're seeing now. And you're not seeing the cartel exploitation back then like we're seeing now as well. So it's all about money for the cartels. What we did encounter was the cartels starting to steal tractors from our farmers and drive them into Mexico. You had that criminal element from the transnational criminal organizations that were coming over, stealing cars, taking them into Mexico, retrofitting them to help smuggle narcotics into the U.S. When you didn't have any infrastructure out in the eastern desert along the Barium Goldwater Range, we were recovering stolen vehicles that had been stuck out there. They were burned to the ground by the cartels and the smugglers. And that's when we started to see an increase in that activity back then it was marijuana. It was a real big thing. And what was really a concern for us was the fact that the U.S. attorneys were not charging these individuals for smuggling narcotics. So Border Patrol agents were just, as a result, were only able to seize the narcotics and then turn them back. That's way back when that they were dealing with this. They would just seize the narcotics and then send them back across the border, voluntary return, because the U.S. attorney wouldn't charge them. And that was back under Sheriff Ralph Ogden when I worked under him. So, and what we did is the sheriff, and I continue it to this day, we cross-deputized federal officers from Border Patrol, so that if the U.S. attorney wouldn't charge these individuals for smuggling narcotics, then they could charge them through the state process, acting under the color and authority of the sheriff. This way, there was 100% consequence delivery. Each and every one of those individuals that were arrested received at least a minimum sentence of 2.5 years in prison. That word got out, and it slowed down the narcotics smuggling in Yuma County. So that was the first thing that we did. We also had to find grant monies to actually buy gates to put up along the farm fields and the canals to prevent the cartels from stealing the farm tractors, because the insurance companies we're basically letting our farmers know that we can't keep paying you for all these stolen tractors. We're going to have to drop you in your insurance. We couldn't have that happen, not in this community. So that's why we ended up paying for the fences and the gates, and then the Bureau of Reclamation installed them for us. So that's the kind of partnerships
Yeah.
and working together. And we were dealing with I don't know if you've ever heard of a rape tree.
No.
Okay, so the smugglers of humans would basically along our river corridor, because there was so much non-indigenous plant life, you could conceal yourself easily in this brush along the river corridor. So you couldn't see them. And we were advised by some individuals that there was a rape tree, which we didn't know back then what that was either. So the smugglers would bring across a group after they paid into the U.S. down there along our river corridor. And when they did reach into the U.S., then the smugglers would actually rape the women and then would hang their clothing on this tree.
Oh my God.
And when we found out about that, we got with our Border Patrol partners and we went down there and we took that tree down. And the second thing was the Border Patrol was able to get funding so we could go down there and get rid of all that non-indigenous plant life that was down along the Colorado River, to cut all that ability for the criminal element to be raping these women and children down there on the border and then hanging their panties and bras on this tree. That was when we started experiencing a lot of the cartel stuff. So on that's on the Baja California side. We have the Sinaloa cartel on their southern part, south of San Luis. And we all know who that is, El Chapo Guzman and his sons that run that. So that's where the partnerships came into place. We've dealt with the rapes, the robberies, the homicides. We just had a homicide suspect in custody that was a smuggler that had a disagreement with the smuggler that he was bringing up. Ended up that guy went off a cliff, died. Working with Border Patrol, we were tracked down the suspect. He just got 10.5 years in prison for that. So unfortunately, when this stuff happens, the local law enforcement are the ones that are tasked with dealing with all these crimes that you see. It's not Border Patrol that deals with them. It's not ICE. It's not anybody else but the locals. So we started seeing an increase in deaths in the desert, and individuals were being left by the smugglers out in the desert because they told them, you only have a day or two. You don't need much water. And they would leave the groups abandoned out in the desert. So we have to deal with those deaths as well.
How many, there's a few things I want to touch on, but real quick on the
So
same subject. How
it's,
many,
it's all encompassing when you look at
sorry, I think we
how
had,
many what?
we had a little bit of a freeze. Let me check the
Yeah.
producers. Everything good on your end? Okay, sounds good. All right, just moving forward, I want to touch on a few things you talked about, but one right now, you mentioned deaths in the fiscal year of 2023. Let's just say, how many deaths did you see? Pretty much, was there an uptick into deaths, or is it slowed down? What is it for you guys right now?
So the last 3 years, 21, 22, 23, 21, we had roughly 30 deaths. In 2022, we had 70 people die in our desert. In 2023, I want to say it was 29 deaths that we've had to investigate out in the desert. 2022 was the worst I've ever seen in my career as far as recoveries of individuals out in the desert. We're still looking for a 15-year-old out in our desert right now.
Just recently?
That just recently, about a month ago, that was abandoned because they were sick by the group. The problem is these groups don't report this stuff until they get to where they're wanting to go in the U.S. because these are the gotaways.
Right.
That's where we're dealing with the deaths out in the remote desert. So it's not right now because of the winter time. We get a lot of winter visitors in Yuma County on top of the agricultural workers. So you get a lot of people out in the desert recreating, and that's where they end up running into these folks that have died and been left out there in the desert. So we go out and recover them.
Yeah, for those who are watching or listening, a lot of illegals or migrants attempting to cross into America find themselves lost in the middle of the desert at times. They don't prepare for the weather, the conditions, and most of them die from dehydration or heat exhaustion, and so on and so forth. And so it is not uncommon for you to be walking in a desert rurally and walk up either on bones at times, because they've been there so long and the animals have already picked the flesh off the bones, or you find the bodies themselves. That's to include if there is river on that border. You will find what they call as floaters. Don't mean to be insensitive with that term, but that's what, they've been found to have, lost a footing or drowned in the Rio Grande River, and then they're found several days later, sometimes weeks later, floating in the river. And so it is not uncommon for migrants to lose their lives in the attempt of coming across. The conditions are harsh. And also, on top of the conditions, the trafficking organizations don't see them as a precious cargo. They just see them as a commodity, a way to make money. And if they're becoming a nuisance or they're not keeping up, well, then they just leave them behind.
Well, it's important for your listeners to understand that this isn't a Mexico thing. What this is the cartels exploiting these individuals. I mean, we've seen upwards of 160 different countries coming into Yuma County. I want to say 2022, 310,000 apprehensions, and those were give ups. Just in Yuma on my border.
Yeah, what countries?
310,000.
Give me some of those countries that maybe the average person would not expect.
So Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, I mean, you name it. If there's there's only 200 and some odd recognized countries, according to the United Nations. We've had 160 of them here. Senegal.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of those,
country.
right. A lot of those countries that we know have terrorist threats towards America or don't see this country in a fair light. And so that becomes a concern for some of the American people, knowing that those type of individuals or those countries that are so far away. I find it fascinating, how much it would probably cost just for them to travel to the Mexican border, to the U.S. Mexican border, and then to attempt to cross illegally. That raises a concern for a lot of people.
Well, and it does for us from a law enforcement perspective. We've seen what happened in 9/11. I mean, everybody is well aware of how that went down. And when you're dealing with that many countries, especially those that are special interest countries that don't want to cooperate with the United States, you're not going to get the criminal background from that country on any of these individuals. And ergo, part of the problem is like this current administration changing all the policies. I can go down to the border right now. I've picked up passports. I've picked up identification cards that they've dumped on the river and their money from their countries, because they know that when they get here, the United States, because of sanctuary cities advertising, that's where they're going to go, because they're told they're going to get health care, they're going to get fed, they're going to get clothing. So that's the draw. I mean, you don't have to be a border czar to understand if you're going to offer something free, they're coming. And New York's finally starting to see that, as well as other states that have decided that they were going to be sanctuary cities. And now those people in those communities have to pay that bill.
Well, Sheriff,
we're not a sanctuary city.
No, I 100% understand that. But what's your opinion on people who are trying to come to America or who are seeking asylum? Those individuals who genuinely are escaping persecution or fear of their own country.
The legitimate ones, from what we understand from this administration at this point in time, from what they have seen, I believe it's only 1 in 8 that actually have a legitimate asylum claim. These are the give-ups that have entered the country illegally between a port of entry. There are so many folks that are sitting on the other side of the border right now that are doing it the legal way. But because folks have entered illegally and been granted access, they're finding it a lot quicker to get into the country that way. And they won't have a hearing scheduled now till 10, 11 years from now. Correct. In regards to their asylum claim. So in the meantime, they're going to be in communities, and most of them are going to the mid part of the country and to the northeast. That's where the majority are. Interesting when you talk to them, New York, Chicago, Sacramento, LA, and some of those are the Russians. At one time, we were getting 70 Russians a day in Yuma. Right now, you're seeing an uptick in Chinese. Those are coming across right now. For Yuma County, just to give you an idea, at one time we were like Tucson is now. We were getting upwards of 12 to 1,600 apprehensions a day just along the river corridor. And then the problem was the getaways. And that's a concern for us and law enforcement is who are these people? What country are they from? And what are their intentions and where are they going into this country?
Correct. So those of you who are
And
listening on,
that's our concern.
just to clarity for those who are listening and watching, a gotaway, it is not an exact science. What happens is an agent would probably see footprints on the ground that someone who has entered into our country, whether it be by river, by jumping a fence, whatever case may be, and then you make a determination of the foot pattern, whether it be 4, 3, 6, 10 people, and as you've tracked that person or those that body of footprints all the way up to say a road, and you don't see those footprints cross that road, well, then it's under our assumption that they've been picked up and they will be now labeled as gotaways. So it's not an exact science, but the number is shocking at how many gotaways have been listed in recent years.
Yeah. Unfortunately, a lot of those are young kids that are with these groups that are not even part of that. They're not a family member, and that's where the exploitation comes in.
Well, can you explain more about exploitation? How's the cartel doing that? What are they threatening with, or what do you know more about the exploitation of these individuals some who want to come here and actually just seek opportunities in America?
Right. So what we see is typically an individual, depending on what country, the range here is anywhere from $6,000 up to, I've heard, up to $15,000 per individual, depending on what country you're from. If an individual cannot afford that, then they will be emboldened to pay the cartel if they're allowed to come in and be smuggled in. So that cartel will designate where they go and what job they will do and how much that cartel will charge them when they get there for the place to live and the food and everything else. And if you're a female, then you'll probably be exploited for that portion. If you're a male, and we've seen it before, U.S. Border Patrol tracked down a group that I believe went into the Carolinas, and they were actually paying off their debt, some of them by doing yard work. So they were working for companies there where they had to work so many hours a day doing yard work for these different landscaping companies to pay their debt to the cartels.
So they're already in the United States and they're already finding work just to pay off their debts from being crossed illegally through the cartel network.
Well, because it's a cartel run organization that's doing the landscaping business. So they're coordinating all this. They're pretty sophisticated.
Yeah.
And some you will be tasked with smuggling narcotics into the U.S. Some will portray themselves as a family unit. And if you're a kid, they found where kids, luckily Border Patrol agents were keeping an eye on individuals and recognized, and that's how we determined it was happening, is they were recycling their kids to pay off their debt. So if a family came across with a child, they knew that you could get into this country and be allowed in. They weren't going to be sent back because you're a family. So these folks would take their child, send it back to that country, and then that child would come back again with a different group of people, portraying that as a family unit. And that was how they were paying off their debt there. So they utilize all kinds of different ways of exploiting individuals when they come across.
So recently, the House GOP effectively rejected the bipartisan legislation to address the border crisis. What was your opinion about that legislation, and why do you think it wasn't passed?
Well, number one, to give you a little history, sheriffs, when Secretary Mayorkas first came on, the border sheriffs, along with national sheriffs, sat down with Mayorkas and said, look, here's a 16-point plan of success for you. We've all been on the border most of our lives and served our communities for a very long time. You have hundreds of years of experience in law enforcement, sitting here willing to work with you side by side to show you a success. He took that 16-point plan and he never even remembered getting it a year later. So that was our first introduction to Secretary Mayorkas on that. Number two, we have been educating our senators, all of us along the border, on what's needed. again, when you see politicians in Washington, D.C., I think they tend to lose focus on the fact that they're there to serve the people, not their interest in Washington, and their personal and political ideologies should not be interjected into public safety. So I don't know if you've had a chance to look at that 300+ page bill.
I haven't looked at the full thing, no.
Yeah, I was going through it yesterday. You mixed law enforcement in with budgeting money from the military to go to Ukraine and to Russia and Taiwan, or not Russia, I'm sorry, to Israel and Taiwan. So that's the first part of this bill. The second part basically goes into changing a lot of the immigration laws, which we're not part of the immigration side. That's not our bailiwick. We don't want it, to be honest with you. But when you read it, everything that they're saying, so they're trying to claim that if there's more than 5,000 a day that come across the border, then they can shut the border down. Well, even the president told the American citizens, I watched him say it, that he needs a law so he can do that. Well, that's not true, because there's already a law that's been in effect for many, many years, INA 212F, gives the president the ability to shut down the border. So in our profession, when you lie, you die. Make sense?
Yes, sir.
So he's already got the ability as a president in law to shut this down. You're just not going to do it. It's all politics. And that's unfortunate.
What?
And that's why we put out a presser on why we don't support this bill, because it doesn't address anything as far as law enforcement and enforcing the rule of law. It just gives more money for more Border Patrol agents to process more people, because it limits the fact that those 5,000 have to be from a contiguous country. If it's a non-contiguous country, then that doesn't apply. They can't be counted. You see what I'm getting at? So
I got you.
I've got 160 countries that are not contiguous to Arizona and Mexico coming in here. They wouldn't be counted.
What?
So you got to look at the law and how they wrote it. You could drive a Mack truck through this thing. I
Right.
mean, it has nothing to do with enforcing the rule of law. I average about $1.2 million in cost for housing illegal aliens in my jail that have committed state crimes. It's an impact on every sheriff across this country. And we're supposed to get reimbursed by the federal government for that. But the only way that we can ask for reimbursement is if that individual has 2 misdemeanor charges or 1 felony charge and has to be in my jail for more than 4 days. So that's their way of limiting reimbursement to us as sheriffs. So out of those 450 people that were in my jail, they were from 20 different countries. But because they didn't meet that criteria, I get reimbursed 5 cents on the dollar. And that doesn't even count my medical costs. They won't reimburse medical.
Right.
I had one individual that was in my jail that needed dialysis 3 times a day. It just about broke our budget, but they won't reimburse you for that. So these are the impacts that sheriffs all across this country are experiencing. And that's under the State Criminal Alien Apprehension Program.
Yeah.
Well, we're supposed to get reimbursed fully on that. Well, I could go on.
No,
all
you
day
could. I mean, we could go on for a while. There's a lot of here, and
we can.
And real quick, so you've done a lot in your career, but I want to keep touching on this. What is the advantage for the current administration to not stop this crisis?
Well, we all know that there is not a single country out there that would come up against the United States. They know that they would not win, right?
I agree.
And we've always been told, even through the FBI, the only way that you can tear this country apart is from the inside out. So what is their end game? I have no idea. Other than it's impacting every community now. You look at our hospital, just during a 6-month period that they did a study on, and this is auditable cost, it was $26 million hit to our hospital, which we only have one in Yuma County. They filled the neonatal ward to the point where locals who had appointments to go through and have their child, their appointments were canceled. And the hospitals, if an individual had a child and the child had to stay in that hospital for a long period of time, you just can't release that individual. So the hospital had to actually pay for motel rooms for the mother of that child for that duration. That's an impact that you're going to see.
Yeah.
The schools are going to be impacted because most teachers, and my wife was a teacher, you're not going to have a teacher that speaks these 100+ different languages to educate folks. That's going to be an impact on your school system. So it just runs the whole gamut. It's impacted our mission. It's impacted our food bank, which a lot of our locals rely on. Yuma County, I think Arizona's unemployment rate's roughly 5% for the whole state. But you look at Yuma County, because it's agricultural community and it's smaller, it goes anywhere from 16 to 24%. So a lot of our locals rely heavily on the mission and the food bank. Now, another impact that we had was these individuals, the kids that were exploited, and the women. So when they were caught or turned themselves in, they had been violated along that track. We have a family advocacy center here. So that has been impacted astronomically as well, because now they're trying to do the criminal side of the forensics for us. But the problem is you don't know who the suspect is or what country this happened in,
Right.
because they can't tell you.
Yeah.
They don't know.
And the aftercare for these women is hard to find.
And that was our concern from law enforcement is, okay, once we do the initial here, is HHS following up with making sure that these kids and these women that were exploited, raped, and everything else done to them, are they following up that care? There's that gap that we're concerned with from a public safety standpoint. The people in Mexico don't want this in their backyard any more than we do.
Right.
But the cartels are the ones these transnational criminal organizations are the ones that are making bank on it, and they're the only ones making money.
Thank you for listening to Borderland, an Ironclad original. These two individuals have spent many, many years on the border, and I think their expertise in the subject, especially in the law enforcement capacity, is valuable for this conversation. Some of the things we've heard today in this episode are things that I've never heard in my entire career, and so I love digging deep into these gentlemen who daily work on the border and see it firsthand.